Here's a poem I wrote last January, about 1 month before what would have been my sister's 44th birthday. I've never been one for Kaddish, for those who aren't mine, until my sister died tragically in her sleep after surgery on her foot that should never have touched her heart. That evening, I found myself at a concert for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and there were cantors and Broadway stars singing music from the camps and the ghettos, from the survivors and the slaughtered. At the end of the evening, solemn and stunning, just melancholy enough to feel just right on a horrible day, the rabbi who emceed the evening invited the audience to rise for Kaddish for the 6 million. And all of a sudden, we became a congregation. And standing around me in a packed Carnegie Hall was a minyan for my sister. Wendy died on the 4th day of Shvat, on my last day in Maine, during my second sabbatical stint. For those who aren't sure, yes, I'm done with my sabbatical. I know it's been a little confusing. Away 3 months, then back, away 2 months, then back, then away another month, but that's all, folks. And it was, for the most part, an amazing experience, except occasionally when it wasn't. Last Yom Kippur, I spoke with you about my time on Maui, where I was writing and hiking and learning to breathe. I was there for a month, so you can imagine my reaction in August as we watched the death toll climb from the wildfires, saw the devastating photographs of Lahaina in flames, 2,000 buildings destroyed, the charred remains of Fleetwoods on Front Street, where Miriam and I celebrated our 20th anniversary, the enormous banyan tree under which I sat with a cup of coffee and smiled as laughing schoolchildren arrived to King Kamehameha III Elementary School across the street. I wasn't staying in Lahaina, but those of you who've been to Maui know it's not a very big island. Lahaina is where I learned to scuba dive. Mala Wharf, where I swam with reef sharks, sea turtles, and a spotted eagle ray, is apparently gone. Portions of the forest where I went hiking have been wiped out. I didn't live on Maui, but because of my intense and life-altering experiences there, it resides not just within my memories, but also my soul. This year, I lost both Lahaina and my sister. Neither belonged to me, but I grieve for both nonetheless. What do we do when someplace or someone important is suddenly gone? That's a hard question to answer, but I want to ask a harder one. What do we do when someone or someplace was already missing from our lives, and then suddenly they're gone forever? You see, while Wendy and I loved each other very much, no doubt, we almost never talked. That's hard to admit, but it's true. And the pain I feel at her passing is only compounded by the finality of that separation. The poem that I read for you wasn't the first that I wrote about Wendy. The first I wrote 3 days after her death, and it was all rage and pain. It's called Unmurdered. 7 murdered in synagogue in Neve Yaakov, 1st degree. 5 murdered Tyree and Memphis in the street, 2nd degree. No one murdered Wendy, my sister, in Lake Zurich, in her home, in her bed, in the night. Not the doctors who had worked in tandem on her foot, on her toes, not the nurses, not her husband who gave her meds the doctors prescribed to take away her pain, not her 9-year-old son, not her foster baby, not her mother, my mother, our mother, not our father who pre-diseased us, who loved us and left us unmurdered in his own time. not I who slept fitfully in Maine in someone else's bed as she took her last breaths 1,000 miles away, 1,000 degrees and 1 degree of separation. No one murdered my sister, no one to blame, not even God. Many of us come from complicated family situations. I know that if I asked for a show of hands right now, dozens, maybe hundreds, might acknowledge some estrangement, an estranged sibling, a parent you don't speak with, a child who won't return your calls. Or maybe there's just a chill, a widening of a gap that somehow became a chasm. Every relationship is different, every reason for distancing unique. What is not unique is the embarrassment many feel about the brokenness within their families. We Don't Talk About Bruno was Billboard's #1 song for 5 straight weeks last year. I think in part because every family has some version of a Bruno. In my case, I grieved for my sister long before she was gone. Our Torah doesn't shy away from familial challenges, does it? Just open the book of Genesis and you find countless stories depicting some of the most dysfunctional relationships that one can imagine. Abraham passes his sister Sarah, or his wife Sarah, off as his sister in order to save his own skin. Handmaids are used and then discarded. Rebecca manipulates Jacob into tricking her husband, his father into bestowing an erroneous blessing. Esau's rage means 20 years in exile for Jacob. Isaac, blind literally and metaphorically, goes along with the whole thing. Joseph's brothers, they sell him into slavery. And let's not forget that only one of the first 2 siblings in the entire Tanakh survives, because one murders the other. If you're looking for a nice story about healthy families, don't read Breshit. I share this not to cast aspersions on our patriarchs and our matriarchs. They were visionaries, and many of them heroic in their own way. The point is that our ancestors were flawed, and they failed at least as often as they succeeded. They are our role models, not because they always behaved well or handled things perfectly. We look to them to understand the complexities of human relationships and to remind ourselves when we struggle that we are not alone. Grief is hard. It's hard even when relationships are pretty good, right? Moses strikes the rock just after his sister Miriam has died, a violation of God's command that keeps him from entering the promised land. It wasn't his best moment, but they were close. When there's estrangement, the loss is compounded, and so often we're caught unawares. In the year 45 before the Common Era, Roman politician and orator Marcus Tullius Cicero found himself in uncharted waters. A devoted Stoic, Cicero was utterly unmade by the sudden passing of his daughter Tullia, who died in childbirth. During his life, Cicero had counseled others, especially other men, on how to grieve, even authoring a treatise entitled Consolatio. The previous year, he had sent the following in a letter to a friend, reminding him that loss and pain are commonplace. It is not for us to refuse to live under the conditions of our birth, nor to resent so impatiently the misfortunes we can by no process of forethought avoid. Suffering is a part of life, says Cicero. Consolation comes from recognizing that our suffering is not unique. But then his daughter died. According to Michael Ignatieff in his 2021 book On Consolation, Cicero was so distraught that he fled Rome to his estate in the Bay of Antium. Utterly cloistered, he spent each day for 6 weeks wandering in the woods alone, disheveled and weeping. when his oldest friend asked after him, Cicero said of his tears, "I fight against them as much as I can, but as yet I am not equal to the struggle." Cicero's breakdown was probably not only because of Tullia's passing. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, marching toward Rome, consolidating his power. The Senate and Republican system of government to which Cicero had devoted his life was under threat. He was under enormous pressure. But it's also true that Cicero hadn't just lost his beloved child. Having distanced himself from her emotionally, having married her off 3 times, placing her in one unhappy circumstance after another, he had not been the father he wished he could have been. Cicero is trapped, says Ignatieff. He had perfected consolation, and now he was inconsolable. He realized too late how much he had loved his daughter. Now the frame that gave meaning to his life collapsed. How do we manage losing the already lost when we don't even get to say goodbye because the infrequency of connection precludes meaningful closure? There's a midrash that says Jacob was the first character in the Torah to grow ill, and that he requested this from God. "I need time to say goodbye," he said. "Death following illness is hard, no doubt. I watched my father wither from cancer. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but sudden loss, particularly after estrangement, is its own horror." So many of my memories of Wendy are from our childhood. Running around campgrounds together, hanging from the play school jungle gym, in our living room, performing magic shows where she was my devoted assistant. As we grew older, we grew apart. And then there were other more acute factors that made the relationship fraught. I don't need to share those details with you here because my point today isn't to unpack what I might have done differently or what she might have. For what it's worth, we were both trying. There were things in motion. But then she was gone. My sister appreciated Leonard Cohen as I do. In fact, I think my first exposure to him as a kid was listening to Wendy play Everybody Knows through the wall between our bedrooms. After she died, I found myself thinking about a lyric from Cohen's final album, which was released just 17 days before his death. "I wish there was a treaty we could sign. I do not care who takes this bloody hill. I'm angry and I'm tired all the time. I wish there was a treaty between your love and mine." Some fractures cannot be mended, and some shouldn't. Some relationships are toxic or abusive. Yom Kippur atones, we're taught, only for the sins between us and God. The harm we do to others, the harm they've done to us, is for human beings to sort out. Sometimes the distance is too great, the wounds too deep. I'd like to believe that with time it could have been different with me and Wendy, that the things that pushed us apart didn't rise to the level of permanence, that we could have found our way back to each other. If I'm honest, we could have done more and sooner, and now we can't. Yom Kippur is a day to consider what could be different in us so that we can be better in the coming year. So think about someone in your life with whom you want or should have a connection. Someone you love, someone who loves you. Maybe not a relationship saturated with pain and trauma, but one hampered by misunderstanding, resentment, or just plain inertia. Ask yourself, is there a treaty that you can sign? Or put differently, what are the possibilities for growth? Growth. makes me think of Maui. Last year on Maui was a time of significant growth for me, but I've been away for over a year now. My Airbnb was on the north side of the island near the start of the Hana Highway. Just minutes from my cabin was a nature preserve created by the late U.S. poet laureate W.S. Merwin, who came to Maui in 1977 when much of the island was still suffering the effects of colonial deforestation from sugarcane plantations. But when I was there, I had no idea that the Merwin Conservancy existed. I learned about it recently from David Stern, a rabbinic colleague in Dallas. Quoting from geobiologist A. Hope Yaren, Rabbi Stern wrote, "Mr. Merwin planted a sapling in the blight, then got up the next day and planted another one. His trees made soil, and the soil made more trees. He planted a tree on that land every day for years until his friends took over after him. Today, the Merwin Conservancy includes 19 protected acres and over 400 species of tropical trees. It appears, thank God, to have been untouched by the wildfires." Merwin wrote a poem called Place, a decade after he came to Maui. "On the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree. What for? Not for the fruit. The tree that bears the fruit is not the one that was planted. I want the tree that stands in the earth for the first time, with the sun already going down and the water touching its roots in the earth full of the dead and the clouds passing one by one over its leaves. Is it a foolish thing to plant a tree on the last day of the world? Perhaps. But then again, none of us knows when the world will end. More importantly, none of us knows when our time in this world will end, will come to an end, and we will have to move to the next. Yom Kippur reminds us of this every year. It forces us to confront our mortality and consider what it means to be inscribed in the book of life. Repent one day before your death, says Rabbi Eliezer to his students in the Gemara. His students reply, but does a person know the day of his death? All the more so, one should repent today, lest she die tomorrow. Take it from me. We can't know how much time we have. So if we want things to change, why wait? What do we have to lose? Maybe our efforts produce no results. Or maybe planting a sapling creates nutrients in the soil, which in turn yields new young shoots. What do you want me to do? Flagellate myself, says Ben Stiller's rabbi character in the movie Keeping the Faith? Jews don't do that. We plant trees. We plant trees. The Midrash says, if you have a sapling in your hand and someone should say to you that the Messiah has come, stay and complete the planting and then go greet the Mashiach. Tree planting is redemptive, even on the last day of the world, but more so at the beginning of a new year. You know, there's a tradition that says that we should begin erecting our sukkah on the day after Yom Kippur. We schlep out those boards and brackets, nails, and bamboo mats from storage. We dust them off and we begin to put the pieces together. On the day after our most solemn day, still weary from our fast, we build something outdoors in the world, a shelter whose purpose is hospitality, to increase connection and through it joy. Plant a tree, build a shelter, mend a relationship. These are acts of faith that restore us to new life in a new year. That minyan in Carnegie Hall was really something. 2,000 people enabling me to say Kaddish. But honestly, I would rather have spent the day in New York with my sister. Good Yantif.